The white stallion had already sent 3 men to the hospital with broken bones and shattered pride, but Jake settled into the saddle anyway, feeling every muscle beneath him coil tight as a loaded spring. In the next heartbeat, everyone watching would discover whether patience and trust could overcome violence, or whether the warnings about that albino giant had been right all along. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust hung thick in the air of the Broken Arrow Ranch that August morning, golden particles dancing in the slanted sunlight like 1,000 tiny warnings nobody wanted to hear. Jake Mercer stood at the corral fence, his weathered hands gripping the rough wood as he watched the creature that had become the talk of 3 counties. The albino stallion moved like liquid silver through the pen, its coat so white it seemed to glow against the brown earth, its pink-rimmed eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. They called him Ghost, though Jake suspected the name had less to do with his coloring and more to do with the fact that he'd sent 3 men to the hospital in as many weeks. Jake was 42 years old, a lifetime spent breaking horses on ranches from Montana to Texas, and he'd never seen an animal quite like this one. The stallion stood 17 hands high, built like a locomotive with shoulders that could probably push through a barn wall if the mood struck him. His mane and tail were pure white silk that caught the wind like battle flags, and when he moved, every muscle rippled beneath that alabaster coat with barely contained power. Beautiful didn't begin to cover it. Terrifying came closer to the truth. Behind him, Jake could hear the murmur of voices as ranch hands gathered to watch what they clearly believed would be either the greatest show of horsemanship they'd ever witnessed or the most spectacular failure. Probably the latter, if the betting pool he'd overheard at breakfast was any indication. The odds were running 5 to 1 that he'd be thrown before he could even settle into the saddle, with longer odds on various injuries he might sustain in the process. "That albino giant will kill you," old Sam Patterson had warned him over coffee that morning, his gnarled fingers shaking slightly as he pointed toward the corral. "I've been working horses for 50 years, son, and I'm telling you straight. That animal's got the devil in him. You mount that beast, you won't walk away whole, maybe won't walk away at all." The warning had been echoed by nearly everyone on the ranch. Maria, the cook who'd been feeding ranch hands for 30 years, had crossed herself when she saw him heading toward the corral after breakfast. The younger hands had watched him with a mixture of awe and the kind of morbid fascination people reserved for watching someone attempt something monumentally stupid. Even Clayton Reeves, the ranch owner who'd hired Jake specifically to break Ghost, had pulled him aside an hour ago, with doubt written all over his weathered face. "Jake, I won't think less of you if you walk away from this one," Clayton had said, his voice low and serious. "That horse has put Mark Dawson in the hospital with 3 broken ribs. Threw Danny Martinez so hard he's still seeing double a week later, and you remember what happened to Rodriguez." The older man had shaken his head, his expression grim. "Fractured pelvis, broken arm, concussion. Doctor says he'll probably walk with a limp for the rest of his life. I brought you here because you're the best horsebreaker I know, but I'm not asking you to die for my pride." Jake had appreciated the concern, but he hadn't traveled 600 miles to turn back now. He'd built his reputation on being able to gentle the unrideable, to find the key that unlocked even the most troubled horse's trust. Ghost represented the ultimate test of that reputation, and Jake couldn't deny the pull he felt toward the challenge. There was something about the stallion that called to him, something beyond the obvious danger and the spectacular display of raw power. The horse had arrived at Broken Arrow 3 months ago, part of a wild herd rounded up in the Northern Territories. Most of the other horses had been broken or sold off within weeks, but Ghost had proven impossible from the start. He'd kicked down 2 stalls, bitten through a lead rope thick enough to tow a truck, and developed a repertoire of tricks that seemed designed specifically to injure anyone foolish enough to get close. He was smart, Jake had realized early on, smart and angry and utterly unwilling to submit to human control. But Jake had spent the past 2 weeks watching Ghost, studying his patterns, learning the language of his movements. He'd noticed how the stallion always circled the corral in the same direction, how his ears flicked back before he kicked, how he calmed slightly when the wind came from the west, carrying scents from the open prairie beyond the ranch boundaries. He'd watched Ghost's reaction to different people, noting that the horse seemed to reserve his most violent responses for men who approached with aggression or fear. It was as if the stallion could smell weakness or hostility and responded in kind. Yesterday, Jake had spent 4 hours simply sitting on the fence, not moving, not speaking, just existing in Ghost's space. The stallion had ignored him at first, then gradually grown curious, approaching close enough that Jake could have reached out and touched that gleaming white coat. He hadn't, though the temptation had been powerful. Instead, he'd remained perfectly still, letting the horse investigate on his own terms, letting Ghost learn that not every human meant pain or confinement. Now, standing in the August heat with half the ranch watching and waiting for him to fail, Jake felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on his shoulders. He'd made his living proving people wrong about horses they'd written off as hopeless. Ghost wasn't hopeless, just misunderstood, mistreated, and mad as hell about his circumstances. Jake understood that kind of anger. He'd carried his own version of it for years after his own father died, leaving him to make his way in a world that didn't much care about one more orphaned ranch hand. The sun climbed higher, turning the corral into an oven, and still Jake waited. Patience was the first lesson in his approach to breaking horses. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes around a horse like Ghost could be fatal. Before we go any further, he thought to himself with a wry smile, tell me where you're watching from. And if this story grabs you, stick around, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about impossible horses and the men fool enough to try taming them. Ghost had stopped his restless circling and now stood at the far end of the corral, watching Jake with those unsettling pink-rimmed eyes. The stallion's ears were forward, his posture alert, but not aggressive. It was the opening Jake had been waiting for. He climbed over the fence with deliberate slowness, his boots hitting the dirt with soft thuds that seemed unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. Behind him, he could hear someone whisper a prayer. Someone else muttered about funeral arrangements. Jake blocked it all out, his entire focus narrowing to the magnificent, dangerous creature before him. This was it. The moment that would define whether his reputation was deserved or just lucky timing finally running out. The moment that would prove Sam Patterson either right or wrong about that albino giant and what mounting him would cost. Jake took his first step forward, dust puffing up around his worn boots, and Ghost's ears flicked back in warning. The real test was about to begin. The distance between Jake and Ghost was 30 feet, give or take, but it might as well have been a canyon for all the danger it represented. Jake moved with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a loaded weapon, each step measured, each breath controlled. His hands hung loose at his sides, palms open and visible, the universal language of peaceful intent that he hoped Ghost might recognize beneath all that rage and fear. Ghost snorted, a sharp explosive sound that echoed off the corral walls and stamped one massive hoof hard enough to send up a cloud of dust. It was a warning, clear as any words. Come closer, and I'll make you regret it. Jake had seen that gesture 100 times from 100 different horses, but something about the way Ghost did it suggested intelligence beyond mere animal instinct. This wasn't blind aggression. This was calculated threat, a chess move designed to establish dominance before the game even began. Jake stopped moving, planted his feet, and simply stood there. The watching crowd murmured behind him, probably thinking he'd lost his nerve, but Jake knew better than to push when a horse was drawing its line in the sand. Give Ghost time to realize the line wasn't being crossed. Time to wonder why this human wasn't charging forward with rope and determination like all the others had. Time to get curious about what made this one different. The August sun beat down mercilessly, and Jake felt sweat beginning to trickle down his spine beneath his shirt. His black leather vest absorbed the heat like a furnace, but he'd learned years ago that horses responded better to his darker clothing. Something about the solid color being less threatening than patterns or bright shades. It was a small detail, but Jake had built his career on paying attention to small details that other horse breakers overlooked. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Ghost remained at his end of the corral, head high, nostrils flaring as he tested the air for scents that might tell him what to expect from this strange human who didn't behave like the others. Jake remained perfectly still, his weight balanced evenly on both feet, his breathing slow and steady. He'd once stood motionless for 3 hours waiting for a traumatized mare to approach him, and he was prepared to stand here all day if that's what Ghost needed. From the fence, Clayton Reeves called out with concern edging his voice. "Jake, you all right out there? You need anything?" Jake didn't turn his head, didn't break his focus on Ghost. "I'm fine," he called back, his voice deliberately calm and unhurried. "Just having a conversation. Give us some time." "A conversation," one of the younger hands muttered loud enough for Jake to hear. "Man's lost his mind. That horse don't want to talk. He wants to kill." But Jake knew better. Every horse wanted to communicate. The problem was that most people didn't know how to listen. Ghost's body language was screaming volumes if you knew how to read it. The position of his ears, constantly swiveling between forward attention and backward wariness. The tension in his shoulders, ready to explode into motion at the first sign of threat. The way he held his head just slightly to the left, favoring that side, suggesting an old injury or perhaps pain from poor handling. All of it told a story of a magnificent animal who'd learned that humans meant pain and confinement, and the loss of freedom he'd known running wild across the northern territories. Jake understood that lesson all too well. He'd learned his own version of it at 14 when his father died and left him to navigate a world where being an orphan with no connections meant being disposable. He'd worked ranches from the time he could barely reach a horse's stirrup, earning his keep through skill and determination because he had nothing else to trade on. Every scar on his hands told a story of lessons learned the hard way, of horses who taught him humility and patience and the absolute necessity of respect when dealing with creatures that could kill you without meaning to. The crowd behind him was growing restless. Jake could feel their impatience like a physical pressure against his back. They'd come to see action, violence, the spectacular clash between man and beast that made for good stories around the bunkhouse fire. Instead, they were getting a staring contest, and their disappointment was palpable. Let them be disappointed, Jake thought. This wasn't about entertainment. This was about survival, his and Ghost's both. If he rushed this, if he let their expectations push him into moving before Ghost was ready, he'd end up like Rodriguez, broken and bleeding in the dust. Or worse. A shift in the wind brought new scents across the corral, and Ghost's head came up sharply, his nostrils flaring wide. Jake recognized the change immediately. The breeze had shifted from the west, carrying with it the smell of open prairie, wild grass, and freedom. Ghost's entire posture altered, the aggressive tension melting into something else entirely. Longing, perhaps. Homesickness for a life he'd lost when the roundup caught him and brought him here to this prison of wooden rails and human expectation. Jake took the opportunity the wind provided. Still moving with careful slowness, he took another step forward, then another. Ghost's attention snapped back to him, ears pinning flat against his skull in renewed warning. But Jake didn't stop this time. He kept moving, steady as a clock, telegraphing every intention through his body language. "I'm not here to hurt you," he thought, as if the horse could hear his internal monologue. "I'm not here to break your spirit or make you into something you're not. I'm just here to show you that not all humans are your enemy." The distance closed to 20 feet. then 15. Ghost pawed the ground, a nervous gesture now rather than aggressive, and Jake could see the war playing out in those strange, pink-rimmed eyes. Fight or flight, the eternal question every prey animal faced when confronted with potential danger. The corral walls eliminated flight as an option, which meant Ghost would choose fight if Jake pushed too hard, too fast, so Jake stopped again. 10 feet separated them now, close enough that he could see the individual hairs in Ghost's flowing mane, close enough to smell the clean horse scent of him mixed with sweat and dust. Close enough to die if Ghost decided he was a threat. Jake lowered himself slowly to one knee, making himself smaller, less intimidating. It was a vulnerable position, and everyone watching knew it. He heard gasps from the fence, heard someone curse in disbelief. "What the hell is he doing?" a voice demanded. "That's suicide. He gets down there and that horse will cave his skull in." But Jake had faith in his reading of Ghost's body language. The stallion was curious now, his aggression fading into uncertainty. This human wasn't behaving like any of the others. This human was making himself vulnerable, offering trust instead of demanding submission. It went against everything Ghost had learned about people, and that contradiction was enough to override his instinct to attack. Ghost took one step forward, then another, his head lowered slightly, nostrils working as he tried to understand this puzzle of a human kneeling in the dust like a supplicant before him. Jake remained absolutely still, barely breathing, letting the horse come to him on Ghost's own terms and timeline. This was the crucial moment, the point where everything could still go catastrophically wrong or miraculously right. The stallion's shadow fell across Jake like a benediction or a death sentence. Time would tell which. Ghost's breath was hot against Jake's face, each exhale carrying the sweet scent of hay and something wilder, something that belonged to open spaces and freedom. The stallion's muzzle hovered inches from Jake's head, and he could feel the animal's uncertainty in the way those nostrils flared and contracted, searching for information that would tell him whether this human represented danger or something else entirely. Jake kept his eyes lowered, not making direct eye contact, which horses interpreted as challenge or threat. Instead, he focused on Ghost's chest, watching the rise and fall of those powerful lungs, reading the rhythm of the horse's breathing for signs of escalating fear or aggression. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, thin and fragile, and ready to break at the slightest wrong move. Behind him, the watching crowd had gone completely silent, as if they collectively held their breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter whatever strange spell Jake was weaving. He could feel their eyes on his back, could imagine the mixture of fascination and horror on their faces as they watched what they surely believed was either the bravest or stupidest thing they'd ever witnessed. Ghost lowered his head further, and Jake felt the velvet softness of the horse's muzzle brush against his shoulder. It was the gentlest of touches, tentative and exploratory, and Jake's heart hammered against his ribs with a mixture of triumph and terror. This was the breakthrough he'd been working toward, the moment when curiosity overcame fear and aggression. But it was also the most dangerous point in the entire process, because Ghost could still decide in a split second that Jake represented a threat and respond with the devastating violence he'd shown to every other human who'd tried to handle him. "Easy," Jake murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Easy there, big fella. Nobody's going to hurt you. Not today. Not ever again if I have anything to say about it." The words were less important than the tone, the soothing cadence that Jake had perfected over years of working with traumatized horses. Ghost's ears flicked forward at the sound, and Jake took it as permission to continue speaking. "You're something special, aren't you? Look at you, magnificent as they come, white as fresh snow and strong enough to pull down mountains. I bet you ran like the wind out there in the territories, leading your herd across the grasslands with nothing to stop you but the horizon." Ghost's breathing had slowed, becoming deeper and more regular. The aggressive tension that had defined his posture was melting away, replaced by something softer, more uncertain. Jake could see it in the way the stallion's weight shifted, in the slight lowering of his head, in the way those pink-rimmed eyes had lost some of their hard wariness. He was still cautious, still ready to bolt or fight if necessary, but the immediate threat level had dropped from critical to merely dangerous. Jake lifted one hand slowly, telegraphing his intention with exaggerated care. Ghost's head jerked up immediately, ears pinning back in warning, and Jake froze with his hand suspended in midair. He waited, counting his own heartbeats, giving Ghost time to realize that the hand wasn't reaching for a rope or whip or any of the tools humans had used to try breaking him. It was just a hand, open and empty, and offering nothing but the possibility of connection. After what felt like an eternity, Ghost's ears slowly came forward again. Jake resumed the movement, raising his hand until it was level with the horse's shoulder. He held it there, steady as a rock despite the tremor of adrenaline running through his system, and waited for Ghost to make the next choice. Would the stallion accept the touch, or would this be the moment when everything went wrong? The sun continued its relentless climb, turning the corral into a furnace, and Jake felt sweat running down his face, stinging his eyes. He didn't wipe it away, didn't move except for the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest with each breath. Ghost lowered his head again, sniffing at Jake's extended hand with the thoroughness of a detective investigating a crime scene. Jake could feel the hot breath against his palm, could see the delicate whiskers around Ghost's muzzle twitching as the horse processed all the information his senses were gathering. Then, so gently it was almost imperceptible, Ghost pressed his muzzle into Jake's palm. The contact sent electricity through Jake's entire body. It was just a touch, the most basic form of connection between human and horse, but it represented a triumph that made all the warnings and doubt and fear worthwhile. He'd earned Ghost's trust, however tentatively, however temporarily. The albino giant who'd sent 3 men to the hospital had chosen to accept rather than attack, to investigate rather than destroy. Jake's fingers curled slowly, carefully, until they were resting against Ghost's jaw. The horse's skin was soft as velvet beneath the short white hair, and Jake could feel the powerful muscles that lay beneath, could feel the barely contained strength that made this animal so dangerous and so magnificent. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good, brave boy. You're all right. Everything's gonna be all right." From the fence, he heard Clayton Reeves exhale sharply. "I'll be damned," the ranch owner said, wonder clear in his voice. "He's actually doing it. He's actually reaching that devil horse." But Ghost wasn't a devil. He was just a wild creature who'd been captured and confined and treated roughly by men who saw him only as a problem to be solved through force. Jake understood that kind of treatment, had experienced his own version of it in the years after his father died, when the world seemed determined to break him down and reshape him into something more convenient, more controllable. He'd survived by learning when to bend and when to stand firm, when to trust and when to protect himself. Ghost was learning those same lessons now, and Jake was determined to be a teacher worth trusting. The hand on Ghost's jaw became a gentle stroke along the horse's neck, and Jake felt the stallion's muscles quivering beneath his touch. Not from fear now, but from the unfamiliar sensation of gentleness, of a human hand that offered comfort instead of pain. How long had it been since anyone had touched Ghost with kindness? Probably not since he'd been captured, possibly never in all his wild years running free. Jake slowly rose from his kneeling position, his hand never leaving Ghost's neck, maintaining that precious connection they'd established. The stallion shifted nervously as Jake stood, his height suddenly making him more threatening again, but he didn't bolt or strike. Instead, he stood trembling, caught between instinct and this new possibility that Jake represented. "You're doing so good," Jake told him, his voice steady and full of genuine praise. "So brave. Most horses would have run by now, or tried to kick my head off. but you're standing here trusting me even though everything you've learned says you shouldn't. That takes courage, big fella, real courage." Ghost's ear swiveled toward Jake's voice, and Jake took it as encouragement to continue. He moved his hand along Ghost's neck, feeling the powerful arch of muscle, the silky texture of that pure white coat. The horse was a masterpiece of nature, built for speed and strength and endurance. Under different circumstances, with different handling from the start, Ghost could have been the foundation stallion for a legendary bloodline. Instead, he'd become the ranch's problem horse, the animal everyone had written off as too dangerous to be worth the effort. Everyone except Jake. He spent the next 20 minutes simply standing beside Ghost, stroking the stallion's neck and shoulders, speaking in that low, soothing voice, building trust, one moment at a time. The watching crowd had dispersed somewhat, the initial drama fading into something quieter and less immediately exciting, but Jake didn't care about entertaining them. His entire focus remained on the magnificent creature beside him, on cementing this fragile bond they'd begun to forge. The real test came when Jake reached for the halter he'd positioned on the fence post before entering the corral. Ghost's eyes tracked the movement immediately, his body going rigid with recognition. He'd seen halters before, felt them tighten around his head, felt the pressure and control they represented. Every muscle in the stallion's body tensed for flight or fight, and Jake knew he was standing at the edge of losing everything they'd just built together. "Easy now," Jake said, holding the halter where Ghost could see it clearly. "This isn't like what they did before. I'm not going to force anything on you. We're going to do this together, you and me. Partners, not enemies." The halter was soft leather, worn smooth from years of use, and Jake had spent an hour last night rubbing it with oil until it was supple as silk. He'd also removed the metal bits that had been on it originally, replacing them with rope loops that would be gentler against Ghost's sensitive skin. Small details that other horse breakers might have overlooked, but Jake knew that with a horse as traumatized as Ghost, every detail mattered. He held the halter in one hand, while keeping his other hand on Ghost's neck, maintaining that physical connection that had become their bridge of trust. The stallion's nostrils flared as he sniffed at the leather, his breath coming faster now, shallow with anxiety. Jake could feel the tension building in Ghost's body like a coiled spring, could sense how close the horse was to exploding into panic-driven violence. "This is the moment," Jake thought. "This is where I find out if I've really reached him or if I've just been fooling myself." He began to lift the halter slowly, moving it toward Ghost's head with the kind of deliberate care usually reserved for handling explosives. Ghost's head jerked up immediately, his eyes rolling white, showing the pink-rimmed whites that made him look even more otherworldly. The stallion took 2 quick steps backward, breaking the physical contact between them, and Jake's heart sank. They were losing it, losing all the progress they'd made. But instead of pushing forward, instead of trying to force the issue the way every other handler had done, Jake stopped. He lowered the halter back to his side and simply stood there, making no move to close the distance Ghost had created. The horse watched him warily, sides heaving, every line of his body screaming readiness to bolt or attack. Jake waited, patient as stone, letting Ghost process what had just happened and what hadn't. "You see that," Jake said quietly. "I stopped when you asked me to. You said no, and I listened. That's how this works between us. You get a say in what happens to you." It was an unusual philosophy in a world where horsebreaking was typically about imposing human will on animal resistance. Most handlers would have called Jake's approach soft, ineffective, a waste of time on a horse as dangerous as Ghost. But Jake had learned over the years that the strongest bonds came from mutual respect, not domination. A horse that chose to cooperate was worth 10 that were forced into submission. Ghost stood at the far end of the corral again, his chest still heaving with agitation, but his ears were forward, focused on Jake. The stallion was thinking, processing, trying to reconcile this human's strange behavior with everything he'd learned about people. After several long minutes, Ghost took one tentative step forward, then another. He was coming back, drawn by curiosity and the memory of that gentle touch that had felt so different from anything he'd experienced before. Jake remained motionless, the halter hanging loose in his hand, making no move to repeat his earlier attempt. Ghost approached until they were standing close again, close enough that Jake could have reached out and touched him, but he didn't. He let the horse make all the choices, let Ghost decide how close was comfortable, let the stallion set the pace and terms of their interaction. The sun had climbed to its zenith now, and the heat was becoming oppressive. Jake felt sweat soaking through his shirt, felt his mouth going dry with thirst and tension, but he ignored all of it. Physical discomfort was a small price to pay for the privilege of earning this magnificent creature's trust. Ghost lowered his head and sniffed at the halter again, more thoroughly this time. His whiskers tickled against Jake's hand as the stallion investigated every inch of the leather, learning its scent and texture, satisfying himself that it posed no immediate threat. Jake held perfectly still, barely breathing, giving Ghost all the time he needed to make his own assessment. "You're smart, aren't you?" Jake murmured. "Smarter than most horses I've worked with. You want to understand things before you accept them. I respect that. Intelligence like yours should be valued, not beaten down." From the fence, Sam Patterson called out, his voice carrying a note of grudging admiration. "Never seen anything like this in 50 years of ranch work. That horse is actually listening to you." Jake didn't respond, didn't want to break the delicate spell between him and Ghost. The stallion had finished his investigation of the halter and was now watching Jake's face again, those strange pink-rimmed eyes full of questions that Jake wished he could answer more directly. All he could do was continue demonstrating through his actions that he was different from the other humans Ghost had known, that patience and respect were possible, that trust could flow both ways. "I'm going to try again," Jake said softly. "But the moment you want me to stop, you let me know and I will. Your comfort matters here. Your consent matters." He lifted the halter once more, moving even slower than before, giving Ghost every opportunity to object. The stallion's ears flicked backward, a sign of nervousness, but he didn't retreat this time. Jake brought the halter up alongside Ghost's head, not trying to slip it on yet, just letting the horse get accustomed to its presence in that space. Ghost's breath came faster, his nostrils flaring wide, but he held his ground. "Good boy," Jake praised, his voice warm with genuine approval. "So brave. You're doing so good." He held the halter there for a long moment, then slowly, incrementally, began to ease it over Ghost's nose. The stallion trembled, every muscle taut with the effort of controlling his flight instinct, but he didn't pull away. Jake could feel the monumental trust Ghost was placing in him, the courage it took for a wild creature to allow this kind of vulnerability. His hands shook slightly as he worked, not from fear, but from the overwhelming responsibility of honoring that trust. The halter slipped over Ghost's nose, and Jake paused, giving the horse time to adjust to the sensation. Ghost tossed his head once, testing the feel of the leather against his skin, but the movement was more exploratory than aggressive. Jake kept up a steady stream of quiet praise as he carefully brought the crown piece up behind Ghost's ears and fastened the buckle with deliberate gentleness. "There," he said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "There you go, all done, see? Wasn't so terrible, was it?" Ghost stood very still, clearly surprised that the haltering hadn't involved pain or force. Jake could see the confusion in those intelligent eyes, the dawning realization that this human had kept his promise. The stallion had set boundaries, and Jake had respected them. The halter was on, but it had happened through cooperation rather than coercion. Jake attached a long lead rope to the halter, letting most of it coil on the ground rather than pulling on it. The rope was just there, present but not controlling, another lesson in trust. Ghost lowered his head to sniff at the rope, nudging it with his muzzle, and Jake smiled at the gesture. The horse was investigating his new reality, trying to understand this strange new dynamic where humans didn't immediately try to dominate and control. The watching crowd had grown again, word having spread through the ranch that something extraordinary was happening in the corral. Jake could hear their murmurs, could feel their amazement, but none of it mattered compared to the victory he'd just achieved. Ghost, the albino giant who'd been declared unbreakable, was standing calmly with a halter on, not because he'd been forced into submission, but because he'd chosen to trust. Jake spent the next hour working with Ghost on basic ground manners, teaching the stallion to respond to gentle pressure on the lead rope, to walk forward and stop on cue, to stand quietly while Jake moved around him. Every lesson was conducted with the same patient approach that had gotten the halter on in the first place. No force, no harsh corrections, just clear communication and immediate reward when Ghost made the right choice. The stallion learned with astonishing speed, his intelligence making the process both easier and more challenging. Easier because he grasped concepts quickly. Harder because he was also quick to notice any inconsistency in Jake's handling, any moment where actions didn't match the promises Jake's gentle approach implied. By the time the sun reached its afternoon angle, casting longer shadows across the corral, Ghost was walking beside Jake with the relaxed posture of a horse that had been handled kindly all his life. It was a transformation that seemed impossible to everyone watching, and Jake could see the disbelief on their faces. Sam Patterson had climbed down from his perch on the fence and was shaking his head in amazement, his earlier dire warnings forgotten in the face of what he was witnessing. "Never thought I'd see the day," the old cowboy muttered as Jake led Ghost past him. "That devil horse walking calm as a Sunday mare. You got some kind of magic in you, boy." "Not magic," Jake replied, pausing near the fence so Ghost could investigate Sam's outstretched hand. "Just patience and respect. Every horse wants to cooperate if you give them a reason to trust you." Ghost sniffed at Sam's weathered fingers with curiosity, and the old man's face split into a wide grin. "Well, I'll be damned. He's gentle as a lamb. Who would have thought?" But Jake knew better than to mistake compliance for completion. Getting the halter on and teaching basic ground manners was just the beginning. The real challenge, the moment that everyone had been waiting for and dreading, still lay ahead. He needed to get a saddle on Ghost's back and then eventually mount the stallion himself. That was when they'd discover whether the trust they'd built was deep enough to withstand the ultimate test, or whether Ghost's wild nature would reassert itself with devastating consequences. Jake decided to end the session there for the day. Pushing too far, too fast, was a recipe for disaster, and he'd learned long ago that patience in the early stages paid dividends later. He removed the halter with the same care he'd used to put it on, praising Ghost lavishly as he did so, and then simply walked away, leaving the stallion standing in the corral with a look of almost comical surprise on his face. Every other human who'd worked with Ghost had kept him confined, controlled, dominated for as long as possible. Jake's voluntary withdrawal was yet another lesson in trust. "I don't need to control you every moment," it said. "I trust you to make good choices on your own." That evening, Jake sat on the bunkhouse porch with Clayton Reeves, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The ranch owner had brought out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, a gesture of celebration for the day's unexpected success. "I owe you an apology," Clayton said, pouring generous measures into both glasses. "When I hired you, I half expected you'd take one look at that horse and tell me he was hopeless. The other half of me worried you'd try anyway and end up crippled or worse." Jake accepted the glass but didn't drink immediately. He was still thinking about Ghost, about the look in those strange pink-rimmed eyes when the stallion had finally accepted the halter. There was intelligence there and pain and a longing for connection that Ghost himself probably didn't fully understand. "He's not hopeless," Jake said finally, "just hurt. Someone mishandled him badly before he got here, probably during the roundup or the transport. Maybe all his life if he's been around humans before. He's learned that people mean pain and confinement, so he fights back with everything he's got." Clayton took a sip of his whiskey and sighed. "Rodriguez said the same thing before Ghost put him in the hospital. Said the horse was scared, not mean. But knowing why a horse is dangerous doesn't make him less dangerous." "True enough," Jake agreed. "But understanding the why gives you a path to changing the behavior. Ghost doesn't want to hurt people. He wants to be left alone, to run free like he did before the roundup. Since he can't have that, he'll settle for being treated with respect and kindness. He's already proved that today." The ranch owner was quiet for a moment, staring out at the darkening prairie. "You really think you can ride him? Not just get through it once, but actually turn him into a working ranch horse?" Jake considered the question carefully. The honest answer was that he didn't know. He'd made remarkable progress today, but there was a vast difference between accepting a halter and accepting a rider. Ghost might tolerate Jake's presence on the ground, but become violent the moment Jake tried to mount. Or the stallion might accept it initially, but explode the first time Jake asked him to do something he didn't want to do. There were 1,000 ways this could still go wrong, but there was also a chance, however slim, that it could go right. "I think," Jake said slowly, "that Ghost has the potential to be the finest horse on this ranch. Maybe the finest horse I've ever worked with. He's got intelligence, strength, and heart. If I can show him that being ridden doesn't mean being controlled or hurt, if I can make it a partnership instead of a battle, then yes, I think he can become everything you hoped for when you bought him." Clayton refilled both their glasses. "And if you can't, then you'll have a very expensive pasture ornament who at least won't try to kill anyone who brings him his feed." Jake smiled wryly. "But I'd rather not settle for that outcome if I can help it." They drank in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the ranch. In the corral, Ghost stood watching them, his white coat catching the last rays of twilight and making him glow like a phantom. Jake could feel the stallion's eyes on him, could sense the questions that must be running through that intelligent mind. What comes next? What? Can I really trust this human? What happens when he asks for more than I'm ready to give? Those were good questions, and Jake didn't have all the answers yet, but he was looking forward to finding them out together. The next morning brought a complication Jake hadn't anticipated. He arrived at the corral to find Clayton standing there with a well-dressed stranger, a man in his 50s with the soft hands and calculating eyes of someone who made his living through deals and negotiations rather than physical labor. "Jake," Clayton said, and there was something apologetic in his tone that immediately put Jake on alert. "This is Marcus Weatherby. He owns the Three Rivers Ranch about 50 miles north of here. He's heard about your work with Ghost and wanted to see for himself." Weatherby extended his hand with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I've been following your career for some time, Mr. Mercer. Your reputation for handling difficult horses is well-deserved, it seems. I'm impressed by what you accomplished yesterday with this animal." Jake shook the offered hand, but wariness prickled along his spine. Men like Weatherby didn't travel 50 miles just to offer compliments. There was an angle here, a purpose beyond simple curiosity. "I appreciate that," Jake said carefully, "but we're just getting started. Yesterday was a good beginning, nothing more." Weatherby smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Modest as well as talented. "I like that. Mr. Mercer, I'll cut right to the chase. I'm prepared to offer you double whatever Mr. Reeves is paying you to come work for my ranch. I have several horses that need your particular expertise, and I'm willing to compensate you very generously for it." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting and troubling in equal measure. Double pay was substantial, enough to change Jake's circumstances significantly. but it would also mean abandoning Ghost before their work was complete, leaving the stallion to potentially regress without the consistent handling Jake's approach required. "That's a generous offer," Jake said slowly, watching Ghost in the corral behind them. The stallion had noticed the stranger and was standing at alert, his earlier calm replaced by renewed wariness. "But I'm committed to finishing what I started here. Ghost needs consistency right now. Bringing in someone new would undo all the progress we've made." Weatherby's expression hardened slightly. "I'm not asking you to leave immediately. Finish with this horse, prove he can be ridden, and then come work for me. Surely Mr. Reeves can't object to that." Clayton shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between business courtesy and genuine concern for Jake's well-being. Jake felt the weight of both men's expectations pressing down on him, but his eyes remained fixed on Ghost. The stallion was pacing now, agitated by the stranger's presence, and Jake could see the tension rebuilding in those powerful shoulders. All the trust they'd established yesterday felt suddenly fragile, threatened not by Jake's actions but by circumstances beyond his control. This was exactly the kind of disruption Ghost didn't need right now, when their bond was still new and untested. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Weatherby," Jake said, choosing his words carefully, "but I don't make commitments until I know what I'm committing to. Right now, my focus is entirely on Ghost. When that work is done, if it gets done successfully, then we can talk about future opportunities." Weatherby's smile tightened into something less friendly. "I'm not a patient man, Mr. Mercer. Opportunities like this don't stay open indefinitely. I need someone with your skills, and I need them soon. My horses are costing me money every day they remain unbroken." "Then perhaps you should find another trainer who's available immediately," Jake replied, his tone polite but firm. "I won't rush my work with Ghost just to accommodate someone else's timeline. That's not how I operate, and it's not fair to the horse." The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Weatherby's face flushed with the kind of anger that came from being told no by someone he considered beneath him. Clayton looked like he wanted to intervene but didn't quite know how without making the situation worse. And Ghost, sensing the conflict between the humans, had stopped pacing and was now standing at the far end of the corral, his body language screaming distrust and readiness to fight. "You're making a mistake," Weatherby said coldly. "I pay my employees well, but I don't tolerate insubordination or delays. If you're not interested in working for a professional operation, then perhaps you're better suited to staying with small-time outfits like this one." The insult to Clayton was deliberate, designed to create division and force Jake's hand. But Jake had spent too many years navigating the political landscapes of various ranches to fall for such an obvious manipulation. He kept his expression neutral, his voice level. "Mr. Weatherby, I'm not your employee, so there's no insubordination to tolerate. I'm finishing a job I agreed to do, and doing it right matters more to me than doing it quickly. If that doesn't align with your needs, then I wish you the best in finding someone who does." Weatherby stared at him for a long moment, his jaw working with barely suppressed fury. Then he turned to Clayton with a dismissive gesture. "Your man here has made his position clear. I hope for your sake he's worth the loyalty you're showing him, because from where I'm standing, he seems more interested in coddling a dangerous animal than in advancing his career." With that parting shot, Weatherby strode back to his carriage and departed in a cloud of dust that seemed to perfectly match his temperament. Clayton let out a long breath and rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm sorry about that, Jake. I didn't know he was going to make a job offer. He sent word he wanted to see Ghost's training, and I thought it was just professional curiosity." Jake shrugged, though he was still processing the encounter and its implications. "No harm done. Though I'd appreciate a heads up next time someone wants to scout me while I'm working. Ghost doesn't need that kind of disruption." "Understood." Clayton glanced at the stallion, who was still standing rigidly at the far end of the corral. "Speaking of which, looks like you've got some fence mending to do." literally and figuratively. He was right. The morning's confrontation had set Ghost back, reminding the stallion of the unpredictability of human behavior, of how quickly situations could turn tense and threatening. Jake could see it in every line of Ghost's body, the renewed suspicion, the readiness to defend himself, the loss of the tentative relaxation they'd achieved yesterday. Jake entered the corral with slow, deliberate movements, hyper-aware that he was essentially starting over. All the ground they'd covered yesterday had to be re-earned, the trust rebuilt from scratch. It was frustrating but not surprising. Traumatized animals often regressed when faced with new stressors, and Ghost had just witnessed raised voices and obvious conflict, both things that probably triggered bad memories of his capture and initial handling. "Hey there, big guy," Jake called softly as he approached. "I know that was unsettling. Strange man showing up, everyone getting tense. But you and me, we're still good. Nothing's changed between us." Ghost's ears flicked toward Jake's voice, but remained partially pinned back in wariness. The stallion held his ground rather than approaching, forcing Jake to close the distance himself. It was a test, Jake realized. Ghost was checking to see if Jake's patience and respect held up under less than ideal circumstances, or if yesterday's gentleness would evaporate when things got difficult. Jake stopped several feet away and lowered himself to one knee again, repeating the gesture that had worked so well the day before. He didn't rush, didn't try to force interaction. He simply made himself available and waited for Ghost to decide what happened next. The wait was longer this time. Ghost studied him with those unsettling pink-rimmed eyes, clearly weighing options and outcomes. Jake could almost see the calculations happening behind that intelligent gaze. Can I trust this human when he's been arguing with others? Is his gentleness real, or just a trick to get me to lower my guard? "I get it," Jake said quietly. "You're not sure if you can believe what you saw yesterday. One good day doesn't erase all the bad ones that came before, but I'm here, same as I was, offering the same deal. Patience, respect, partnership. No force, no pain, just two creatures trying to understand each other." Minutes stretched into an hour. The sun climbed higher, turning the corral into an oven once again. Sweat trickled down Jake's back, and his knee began to ache from kneeling on the hard-packed earth. But he didn't move, didn't show impatience or frustration. This was part of the process, part of earning Ghost's trust on a deeper level. Anyone could be kind for a day, proving that kindness was consistent, that it held up under pressure and disappointment, that required time and demonstration. Finally, Ghost took one hesitant step forward, then another. The stallion's approach was cautious, each movement deliberate, ready to bolt at the first sign that Jake had changed. But Jake remained perfectly still, his posture open and non-threatening, his expression calm and welcoming. Ghost came close enough that Jake could feel the horse's breath on his face once more, and this time, when the stallion lowered his head to sniff at Jake's shoulder, there was recognition in the gesture. Memory of yesterday's positive experience beginning to outweigh the morning's negative one. "There you are," Jake murmured, slowly raising his hand to rest against Ghost's jaw. "I knew you'd come back. You're too smart to let one bad moment destroy all the good we've built." Ghost leaned into the touch, and Jake felt something shift between them. This wasn't just trust anymore. It was the beginning of a genuine bond, a connection that went beyond simple training exercises. Ghost was choosing Jake, not just tolerating him. Choosing to believe that this human was different, that the partnership Jake offered was real and worth the risk. They spent the rest of the morning reinforcing yesterday's lessons, but with an added depth that came from having weathered their first real challenge together. Ghost responded to the lead rope with even more cooperation than before, walked beside Jake with the relaxed posture of a horse that had decided its handler was trustworthy, When Jake introduced a soft brush and began grooming the stallion's gleaming white coat, Ghost stood like a statue, eyes half closed in pleasure at the attention. By lunchtime, Jake felt confident enough to introduce the next major step, the saddle blanket. He brought out a thick wool pad, worn soft from years of use, and let Ghost investigate it thoroughly. The stallion sniffed every inch of the fabric, pawed at it when Jake laid it on the ground, and eventually seemed to accept that it posed no threat. Jake picked up the blanket and held it where Ghost could see it clearly. "We're going to put this on your back," he explained, as if the horse could understand every word. "It's going to feel strange at first, having weight on you that you didn't choose, but I promise it won't hurt, and I promise you can tell me if it's too much." He moved slowly, telegraphing every intention, and gently draped the blanket across Ghost's withers. The stallion tensed immediately, his muscles going rigid beneath the unfamiliar weight. Jake kept one hand on Ghost's neck, maintaining that physical connection, and used his voice to soothe and reassure. "You're okay," Jake murmured, his hand moving in slow circles against Ghost's neck. "It's just a blanket, soft and warm, nothing to fear. Feel how it rests on you? No pressure, no pain. Just there." Ghost's ears swiveled wildly, trying to locate the source of this new sensation on his back. His head turned as far as his neck would allow, attempting to see what Jake had placed on him. The stallion's breathing had quickened, shallow pants that spoke of rising panic, and Jake knew they were approaching another critical moment. If Ghost exploded now, if the fear of having something on his back overwhelmed the trust they'd built, it could undo days of careful work. Jake began to walk slowly around Ghost, trailing his hand along the stallion's body so the horse always knew where he was. He adjusted the blanket minutely, ensuring it sat evenly across Ghost's back, that no folds or wrinkles might cause discomfort. The stallion tracked his movement with those pink-rimmed eyes, every muscle quivering with the effort of not bolting or bucking. It was a testament to how far they'd come that Ghost was fighting his instincts, choosing to trust Jake rather than give in to fear. After several minutes of letting Ghost adjust to the blanket's presence, Jake slowly pulled it off and laid it on the ground. Ghost's relief was palpable, his entire body relaxing as the weight disappeared, but Jake wasn't finished. He picked up the blanket and placed it on Ghost's back again, repeating the process. Off, then on. Off, then on. Each repetition teaching Ghost that the blanket wasn't permanent, that it could be removed, that having something on his back didn't mean being trapped forever. They worked on this exercise for over an hour, until Ghost stood calmly with the blanket draped across him, no longer tensing or panicking at its presence. It was painstaking work, repetitive and requiring endless patience, but Jake knew this foundation was crucial. Every shortcut he avoided now would pay dividends later when the real challenges came. That evening, Jake found himself sitting alone in the barn, cleaning and oiling his saddle by lamplight. It was a ritual he'd performed countless times over the years, the familiar smell of leather and oil bringing a sense of calm to his mind. But tonight his thoughts kept returning to the morning's confrontation with Marcus Weatherby and the choice he'd made to refuse the job offer. Double pay would have changed his life. He could have saved money, maybe even bought a small place of his own eventually instead of moving from ranch to ranch like a tumbleweed. But the thought of abandoning Ghost before their work was complete left a sour taste in his mouth. The stallion had trusted him, had chosen to believe in Jake's promises of patience and respect. Walking away from that trust for money would make him no better than all the other handlers who'd treated Ghost as nothing more than a problem to be solved or a resource to be exploited. "You're getting soft in your old age, Mercer," he muttered to himself, running the oiled rag along the saddle's stirrup leathers. "Getting attached to a horse that'll probably kill you before this is all over." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Ghost wouldn't kill him. The stallion had already proved he could control his violent impulses when given reason to, could choose cooperation over conflict when treated with respect. The real question was whether Jake could help Ghost overcome years of trauma and conditioning quickly enough, completely enough to turn him into the kind of horse that could thrive in ranch life. The barn door creaked open, and Clayton Reeves stepped inside, carrying 2 mugs of coffee that steamed in the cool evening air. "Thought you might want some company," the ranch owner said, handing 1 mug to Jake. "And maybe some conversation about this afternoon." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around its warmth. "If you're worried about me turning down Weatherby's offer, don't be. I meant what I said about finishing what I started." Clayton settled onto a hay bale with a sigh. "I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about what happens when word gets around that you refused him. Marcus Weatherby isn't the kind of man who takes rejection well, and he has influence in these parts. Could make things difficult for you down the road." "I've faced difficult before," Jake replied. "I'll manage." The ranch owner studied him over the rim of his mug. "Why'd you really turn him down? And don't give me that line about commitment. We both know you could have negotiated something that satisfied everyone. Finished here, then gone to work for Weatherby with my blessing, and probably a bonus for your trouble." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering how to put his feelings into words. "Ghost needs consistency right now," he said finally. "Not just in training methods, but in the person doing the training. He's starting to trust me specifically, not humans in general. If I left before that trust was solid, before he generalized what he's learning to other people, he'd likely regress completely. Might even end up worse than when I started, more distrustful and dangerous, because he'd learned that even the gentle humans eventually abandon you." Clayton nodded slowly. "So it's about the horse, not the money or the opportunity. It's about doing right by a creature that's already been wrong too many times," Jake corrected. "Ghost didn't ask to be caught and brought here, didn't ask to be handled roughly by men who saw him as a challenge to their masculinity, rather than a living being deserving of respect. He's paying the price for human arrogance and impatience, and I'll be damned if I'm going to add to that burden by putting my own advancement ahead of his well-being." The ranch owner's expression softened with something that might have been respect or admiration. "You're a better man than most, Jake Mercer. This world could use more people who think like you do." Jake shook his head. "I'm not better than anyone. I just know what it's like to be written off as hopeless, to have people give up on you before you've had a real chance to prove yourself. Ghost deserves better than that. Every creature does." They drank their coffee in companionable silence, and Jake found himself thinking about his own past, about the years after his father died when he'd been shuffled from ranch to ranch. Always the temporary help, never quite belonging anywhere. He'd learned early that loyalty was a rare commodity in a world where everyone was looking out for their own interests first. Maybe that's why he felt such kinship with Ghost. They were both survivors of circumstances beyond their control, both trying to find their place in a world that hadn't been particularly kind to them. The next morning brought a surprise in the form of Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who served several ranches in the area. Clayton had called her in to give Ghost a thorough examination, checking for any physical issues that might be contributing to his aggressive behavior or that might complicate the training process. Sarah was a small woman in her 30s, barely 5 feet tall, but she had a presence that made up for her lack of physical stature. She'd earned her degree back east and come west looking for adventure, and had quickly developed a reputation as one of the best animal doctors in the territory. She approached Ghost's corral with the confident calm of someone who'd handled dangerous animals before and survived to tell the tale. "How's he been since the halter work?" she asked Jake, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Ghost's appearance and behavior. "Better than expected," Jake replied. "We've been working on the saddle blanket. He's tolerating it now, though he's not comfortable yet." Smart approach, Sarah said approvingly. Too many trainers rush to the saddle and wonder why the horse loses its mind. She opened her medical bag and pulled out a stethoscope. Think he'll let me examine him? Only one way to find out, Jake said, but I'll be right there with him. He trusts me more than he trusts strangers. Together they entered the corral, and Jake could immediately feel Ghost's anxiety level rising at Sarah's presence. The stallion's nostrils flared as he tested her scent, his ears pinning back in warning. Easy, Ghost, Jake said, moving to stand beside the stallion and placing a calming hand on his neck. This is Sarah. She's here to help, not hurt. She needs to check you over, make sure you're healthy and strong. Sarah approached with admirable patience, moving even slower than Jake typically did, her body language deliberately non-threatening. She kept her medical bag partially hidden behind her, knowing that unfamiliar objects could trigger defensive responses in traumatized animals. When she was close enough, she extended one hand for Ghost to sniff, the same gesture of introduction that had worked for Jake. "Hello, handsome," she said softly, her voice carrying a melodic quality that seemed to catch Ghost's attention. "My goodness, you're even more magnificent up close. Look at that bone structure. Those lines. You're built like a dream, you know that?" Ghost's ears flicked forward slightly, curiosity beginning to override wariness. Sarah's genuine admiration was evident in her tone, and animals had an uncanny ability to sense when praise was authentic versus manipulative. The stallion allowed her to touch his muzzle briefly before pulling back, not rejecting the contact entirely, but setting boundaries about how quickly this new relationship would progress. "Smart boy," Sarah murmured approvingly. "You know your limits and you enforce them. I respect that." She spent the next 20 minutes conducting a thorough examination, working in careful increments with Jake's help to check Ghost's teeth, eyes, ears, and body condition. The stallion tolerated most of it with surprising patience, though he grew noticeably tense when Sarah palpated his left shoulder. She made a note of it and continued her examination, her practiced hands moving over Ghost's legs, checking for old injuries or structural issues. When she finally stepped back, her expression was thoughtful. "He's in excellent physical condition overall," she told Jake. "Strong, well-muscled, no signs of disease or parasites. But that left shoulder has some old scar tissue, probably from an impact injury. Maybe he ran into something during the roundup or someone hit him there trying to control him." Jake's jaw tightened at the thought of anyone striking Ghost. Could that be affecting his behavior? "Possibly," Sarah replied. "It's not causing him significant pain now, but it might have when it first happened, and pain creates fear memories. If someone hurt him there, either deliberately or accidentally, he might associate human touch in that area with suffering. Can we do anything about it?" "Time and gentle massage might help break down some of that scar tissue," Sarah said. "I can show you some techniques. But honestly, what you're already doing, building trust and working slowly, that's the best medicine for psychological wounds. Physical healing is easy compared to emotional healing." She packed up her medical bag and looked at Ghost with obvious admiration. "He's going to be spectacular when you're finished with him, Jake, assuming you can get through the next few stages without getting yourself killed." "That's the plan," Jake said wryly. "Stay alive and help Ghost become the horse he was meant to be." After Sarah left, Jake spent time working on Ghost's shoulder exactly as she'd shown him, using gentle circular motions to massage the area around the scar tissue. Ghost was initially resistant, his body going rigid when Jake's hands approached that sensitive spot. But gradually, as Jake maintained steady, gentle pressure combined with soothing words, the stallion began to relax. His head lowered, his breathing deepened, and by the end of the session, Ghost was actually leaning into Jake's touch, seeking out the relief it provided. These small victories accumulated over the following days. The saddle blanket became routine, something Ghost accepted without resistance. Jake introduced a lightweight saddle, letting Ghost wear it for increasingly longer periods while they worked on ground exercises. The stallion adjusted to each new challenge with the remarkable adaptability that characterized his intelligence, though there were still moments of backsliding, times when fear or memory would trigger defensive responses. A week after Sarah's visit, Jake decided they were ready for the next major milestone. He'd been preparing for this moment, had dreamed about it and worried over it in equal measure. Today, he would attempt to mount Ghost for the first time. Not a full ride, just getting on and off, proving to the stallion that having a human on his back didn't mean pain or loss of control. It was the most dangerous thing Jake would attempt, the moment when even the best-trained horses sometimes exploded into violent bucking or bolting. The morning was clear and cool, perfect weather for such a crucial test. Jake arrived at the corral to find a crowd already gathering, word having spread that today was the day Jake Mercer would either prove his methods worked or prove Sam Patterson's dire warnings right. The old cowboy was there himself, perched on the fence with a mixture of hope and dread on his weathered face. Jake ignored them all, his entire focus on Ghost. The stallion stood calmly in the center of the corral, the saddle already in place from their earlier session. Jake had spent an extra hour this morning grooming Ghost, not just for practical purposes, but as a way of reinforcing their bond, reminding the horse through touch and attention that they were partners in this endeavor. He entered the corral carrying a mounting block, a simple wooden step that would make it easier to reach the stirrup. Ghost watched him approach with those intelligent pink-rimmed eyes, and Jake thought he detected a question in that gaze. What's different about today? What new thing are you going to ask of me? Today's a big day, buddy, Jake said, setting down the mounting block beside Ghost. Today we find out if all this trust we've built is strong enough to hold both of us. He began by simply standing on the mounting block, making no move to touch the saddle or stirrup, just getting Ghost accustomed to having a human elevated above him, seeing Jake from a different angle. The stallion's ears swiveled, tracking this change in their routine, but he didn't move away. Good. That was good. Jake stepped down and repeated the process several times, up and down, until it became boring and predictable. Then he added the next element, placing his foot in the stirrup while keeping his weight on the ground. Ghost's muscles tensed beneath the saddle, feeling the shift in pressure, the beginning of what he surely knew was coming. Easy, Jake murmured, his hand stroking Ghost's neck. Just my foot. Nothing scary. You've felt this before with the other handlers, I know. But this time it's different. This time I'm asking, not forcing. He put weight on the stirrup gradually, testing Ghost's reaction at each increment. The stallion shifted his feet, adjusting to the uneven pressure, but he didn't bolt or buck. His breathing had quickened, shallow pants that spoke of anxiety, but he was controlling it, choosing to trust rather than panic. The watching crowd had gone silent, everyone holding their breath as they witnessed this delicate dance between man and horse. Jake could feel their eyes on him, could sense their mixture of hope and morbid fascination. But he blocked it all out, his world narrowing to just him and Ghost, to this moment that represented the culmination of weeks of patient work. He pulled himself up slowly, his weight now fully in the stirrup, his body pressed against Ghost's side. The stallion trembled beneath him, every muscle quivering with the effort of not exploding into panicked flight. Jake stayed there, suspended between ground and saddle, speaking in a continuous stream of soothing words. You're so brave, Ghost. So strong and brave. I know this is hard. I know every instinct you have is screaming at you to run. But you're choosing to stay, choosing to trust me. And I swear to you, I will never betray that trust. Then, moving with the same careful deliberation that had characterized every step of their journey together, Jake swung his leg over Ghost's back and settled gently into the saddle. For one frozen moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jake sat perfectly still in the saddle, his weight distributed evenly, his hands resting lightly on his thighs rather than gripping the reins. Beneath him, he could feel Ghost's entire body coiled tight as a spring, every muscle locked in suspended tension. The stallion's breathing had stopped completely, as if he too was frozen in this moment of truth, waiting to see what would happen next. Jake didn't move, didn't speak, just existed in that space of connection with Ghost. He could feel the stallion's heartbeat through the saddle, could sense the war raging inside that magnificent animal. Every instinct Ghost possessed was surely screaming at him to buck, to run, to throw off this weight and flee to safety. But there was something else there too, something stronger than instinct. Trust. The fragile but growing trust they'd built together over weeks of patient work, of promises kept and boundaries respected. Seconds stretched into eternity. The watching crowd remained silent, scarcely daring to breathe. Sam Patterson had both hands gripped on the fence rail, his knuckles white with tension. Clayton Reeves stood with one hand over his mouth, as if physically holding back words that might shatter the delicate moment. Even the other ranch hands, who'd seen countless horses broken and ridden, watched with the awe of witnessing something unprecedented. Then Ghost took a breath. Deep and shuddering, it moved through his entire body, and Jake felt the tension begin to drain from those powerful muscles. The stallion's head lowered slightly, no longer held in that rigid posture of fight-or-flight readiness. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, slowly rotated forward. And most telling of all, Ghost took one careful step forward, then another, carrying Jake's weight without panic or resistance. Jake felt tears prick at his eyes, though he'd never admit it to anyone watching. This moment, this quiet miracle of a traumatized horse choosing trust over fear, choosing cooperation over conflict, represented everything he'd dedicated his life to achieving. Ghost wasn't broken. He was healed, or at least beginning to heal. The difference mattered more than Jake could put into words. "Good boy," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Oh, you magnificent, brave, beautiful boy. Look at you. Look at what you're doing." Ghost walked in a slow circle around the corral, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he was still processing this new reality of carrying a rider who didn't yank on his mouth or dig spurs into his sides. Jake sat quietly, making no demands, asking nothing except that Ghost continue to trust that this wouldn't hurt, wouldn't harm, wouldn't diminish the stallion in any way. After several minutes of walking, Jake carefully dismounted, swinging his leg over and sliding to the ground with the same gentle deliberation he'd used to mount. Ghost turned his head to watch, those pink-rimmed eyes full of questions and dawning understanding. The weight was gone, just as Jake had promised it would be. Nothing permanent, nothing to fear. Just another experience they'd shared and survived together. Jake pulled off the saddle and blanket, setting them aside, then spent long minutes simply standing with Ghost, stroking that gleaming white coat, murmuring praise and gratitude. The stallion leaned into his touch, his massive head resting against Jake's shoulder in a gesture of affection that made Jake's heart swell with pride and love for this incredible animal. From the fence, the watching crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Sam Patterson was wiping his eyes with a bandana, not bothering to hide his emotion. Clayton Reeves was grinning like a man who'd just witnessed a miracle, which in many ways he had. The younger hands were slapping each other on the back, exchanging money as betting pools were settled. Jake had proved that the albino giant could be ridden, that patience and respect could achieve what force and dominance never could. But Jake barely registered their celebration. His world had narrowed to just him and Ghost, to the profound connection they'd forged through weeks of careful work and mutual trust. This wasn't about proving the doubters wrong or validating his methods. This was about honoring a promise he'd made to a traumatized creature, about giving Ghost back some measure of the dignity and agency that had been stolen from him. That evening, Jake sat on the bunkhouse porch alone, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Ghost stood in his corral, no longer pacing restlessly as he had when Jake first arrived, but grazing peacefully, occasionally lifting his head to look toward the bunkhouse as if checking that Jake was still there. The sound of approaching footsteps made Jake turn. Sarah Chen climbed the porch steps, carrying a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Thought you might want to celebrate properly," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "That was remarkable what you did today. I've been working with animals for 10 years and I've never seen anything quite like it." Jake accepted the glass she poured for him. "It wasn't just me. Ghost did the hard part. He's the one who chose to trust despite everything he'd been through." Sarah raised her glass in a toast. To Ghost then, and to the stubborn cowboy who refused to give up on him. They drank in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "What are you going to do now? You've proved Ghost can be ridden. Clayton's got his valuable stallion back. Your work here is essentially done." Jake had been avoiding thinking about that question, though he knew it was coming. The truth was, he didn't want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Over the past weeks, Ghost had stopped being just another job, just another horse to train. The stallion had become something more, a friend, a partner, a living testament to the power of patience and compassion over force and fear. "I'm going to stay until Ghost is solid," Jake said finally, "until he's comfortable with other riders, until he's proven he can be a working ranch horse, not just my personal project. He deserves that, deserves to have a real future here, not just be the horse that one guy could ride." Sarah studied him with knowing eyes. "You're attached to him. This stopped being just business a long time ago, didn't it?" Jake didn't deny it. How could he? Every scar on his own heart recognized the scars on Ghost's every lonely year of his own wandering life connected with the stallion's loss of freedom and home. They were kindred spirits, he and Ghost. Both survivors. Both still learning to trust again after betrayal and loss. "Maybe attachment isn't such a bad thing," Jake said quietly. "Maybe caring about the creatures we work with makes us better at what we do. Maybe Ghost responded to me because he could sense that I saw him as more than just a problem to solve." Sarah nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "You're probably right. The best healers, whether they work with people or animals, are the ones who care enough to see beyond the symptoms to the soul underneath." They finished their drinks as full darkness settled over the ranch. In the distance, Ghost whinnied softly, and Jake found himself smiling at the sound. Tomorrow they'd work on having other people handle the stallion, on expanding Ghost's trust from one human to several. It would be challenging work requiring patience and care. But Jake was ready for it. He and Ghost both were. The albino giant who'd been declared unbreakable was broken no more. And the cowboy who'd mounted him anyway had discovered something precious in the process, a connection that transcended the practical boundaries of horse training and touched something deeper in both their spirits. Whatever came next, they would face it together. 3 months later, Jake stood in the same spot where he'd first watched Ghost pace the corral with murder in his eyes. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The white stallion now grazed peacefully alongside other ranch horses, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, his posture relaxed and content. Young Danny Martinez, who Ghost had thrown so violently weeks before Jake's arrival, was brushing the stallion's mane with confident strokes, talking to the horse about his day as if they were old friends. It had taken weeks of careful work to expand Ghost's trust beyond Jake. Every new handler had to learn Jake's methods, had to approach the stallion with the same patience and respect that had first broken through his defenses. Not everyone had the temperament for it. 2 ranch hands had given up after a few sessions, frustrated by the slow pace and deliberate gentleness required. But those who persisted discovered what Jake had known all along. Ghost wasn't dangerous. He was discerning. He responded to kindness with loyalty, to respect with cooperation, to patience with trust. Clayton Reeves approached Jake with a letter in his hand and a complicated expression on his weathered face. "This came for you this morning," he said, handing over the envelope. "It's from Marcus Weatherby." Jake took the letter with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He'd heard through the ranch grapevine that Weatherby had gone through 3 trainers in the past months, none of them able to handle his difficult horses with anything approaching Jake's success with Ghost. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, laden with implications he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. He opened it and read quickly. Weatherby's offer was even more generous than before, nearly triple his current pay, with promises of a permanent position and a percentage of profits from successfully trained horses. It was the kind of opportunity most horse trainers would kill for, the chance to establish himself at a prosperous ranch with unlimited resources and a steady stream of challenging work. "What are you going to tell him?" Clayton asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Jake folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. "I'm going to tell him no, same as before." Clayton nodded, unsurprised but clearly relieved. "Can't say I'm sorry to hear that. You've done good work here, Jake, real good work. Not just with Ghost, but with the whole operation. The other hands have learned from watching you. They're gentler with the horses now, more patient. You've changed the culture of this place." The praise made Jake uncomfortable, as it always did. He'd never sought recognition, just the satisfaction of doing his work well and treating animals with the respect they deserved. But looking around the ranch, seeing the evidence of positive change, he couldn't deny the truth in Clayton's words. Ghost had been the catalyst, but the ripple effects had spread far beyond one traumatized stallion. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Clayton continued. "I've been thinking about making some changes around here, expanding our operation, maybe specializing in taking difficult horses and rehabilitating them. Could use someone with your expertise to run that side of things, someone who could train other trainers in your methods." Jake felt his heart skip. It was the kind of proposition he'd dreamed about but never dared hope for. A permanent position, a real home, the chance to do meaningful work that helped both horses and people. But more than that, it meant staying with Ghost, watching the stallion continue to grow and thrive, being part of his ongoing story. "I'd need to think about it," Jake said, though they both knew he was already convinced. "Make sure it's really what you want, not just a reaction to Weatherby's offer." "Fair enough," Clayton replied with a knowing smile. "You take your time, though I should mention the position comes with that cottage near the east pasture, the one with the good well and the shade trees. Figured you might be tired of bunkhouse living after all these years." The cottage. Jake had admired it from a distance, had imagined what it might be like to have a place of his own, somewhere that felt like home rather than just another temporary stop on an endless journey. The possibility opened something in his chest, a hope he'd kept carefully locked away for fear of disappointment. That evening, Jake rode Ghost for the first time across open prairie, beyond the confines of the corral and training areas. The stallion moved beneath him with power and grace, his white coat brilliant against the golden grass, his stride eating up the miles with effortless strength. Jake gave him his head, letting Ghost choose the pace and direction, trusting the horse's instincts and judgment. They ran until the ranch buildings were distant specks behind them, until the only sounds were wind and hoofbeats and Ghost's rhythmic breathing. Then Jake slowed the stallion to a walk and they stood on a small rise overlooking a valley where a creek wound through stands of cottonwood trees. The sunset painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and Jake felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. "This is what freedom feels like," he said to Ghost, his hand resting on the stallion's neck. "Not running away from something, but running toward it, choosing where we go and who we go with." Ghost turned his head, those pink-rimmed eyes meeting Jake's with an intelligence and understanding that still took his breath away. The stallion had taught him as much as he'd taught Ghost, Jake realized. About patience and trust, about the power of gentle persistence over forceful domination, about the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds given enough time and care. They rode back to the ranch as the stars began appearing in the darkening sky. The cottage windows glowed with lamplight, a beacon of home and belonging that Jake had never allowed himself to believe in. Tomorrow he'd give Clayton his answer. Tomorrow he'd begin building something permanent, something meaningful, something that honored the journey he and Ghost had traveled together. The warnings had been dire. "That albino giant will kill you," they'd said. The cowboy mounted anyway and discovered something the doubters could never have imagined. Not death but life, not defeat but triumph, not the breaking of a wild spirit, but the healing of two wounded souls who'd found in each other exactly what they needed. Jake dismounted in the yard and removed Ghost's saddle, running his hands one last time over that gleaming white coat. The stallion nuzzled his shoulder affectionately, and Jake smiled at the gesture. They'd come so far from that first tense morning when Ghost had stood ready to kill anyone who came close. Tomorrow, Danny Martinez would take Ghost out for a ride, continuing to build the stallion's trust in other handlers. Next week, Clayton was bringing potential buyers to see Ghost's progress, not to sell him but to demonstrate what gentle training methods could accomplish. And next month, if Jake accepted the position he knew he would, they'd begin taking in their first rescue horses, animals that other ranchers had given up on, creatures that needed someone to see beyond their trauma to the potential underneath. As Jake walked toward the bunkhouse, he turned back one last time to look at Ghost. The stallion stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, magnificent and free and finally at peace. Their story had started with fear and suspicion, with warnings about danger and death. But it had become something else entirely, a testament to the transformative power of patience and compassion, a reminder that the strongest bonds are built on trust, not dominance, a living example of what becomes possible when we choose to see the soul beneath the scars. The albino giant hadn't killed him. Instead, Ghost had given Jake something far more precious, a purpose, a home, and a future worth staying for. And in return, Jake had given Ghost back his dignity, his trust, and the freedom to choose his own path. It was, Jake thought as he climbed the bunkhouse steps, a fair trade. More than fair. It was everything.